Welcome everybody to Historical Writers Forum's latest chat, which is My Era's Better Than Yours. If I can ask everybody to turn your cameras off while the speakers are talking, and your audio as well. Make sure your microphone's on mute in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Otherwise, if you make a noise, the camera skips to you as the main viewpoint. Let me just make, I'll do that in a minute. Yes, so my name's Sharon Bennett Connolly. I'm a historical non-fiction author who writes mainly about women's history. Although I did do a biography of the Warren family, the Earls of Surrey, which was fascinating to do, and so much easier than doing women's history because there's so much more about men out there than there is about women. Hold on, let me just check. Yeah, what we're going to do is have our 5 authors talk about their favourite era, and then I'll see if I can come up with some good questions for them. But after that, it will be questions from the audience, and then a final vote.
No, these are people coming on TV.
So if you would like to ask any questions, either wait till the end or put them in chat and I'll ask them near the end. I'm going to change the view now to speaker and introduce our 5 authors this evening. First up, we have Jacquie Rogers, who lives in the Malvern Hills in England and has had careers including advertising and university lecturing before finding that writing suited her best. She is author of the Quintus Valerius, is that how to pronounce it, Jacquie? Oh, good. Roman mystery series set in 3rd century Roman Britain and beyond. Published books so far include The Governor's Man, The Carnelian Phoenix, and a linked short story in Roman anthology called Imperium. Then we have Salina B. Baker, who is the author of a multi-award-winning adult historical fantasy series about the American Revolution, Angels and Patriots, or in Salina's language, because she's American, Angels and Patriots. Starting with book 1, Sons of Liberty, Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill. Her extensive travels follow the footsteps of the compelling historical people, places and events she passionately writes about and brings to life. She is currently writing a novel about Revolutionary War General Nathaniel Greene titled The Line of Splendor. And I'm going to say this, if you join Salina's Instagram account, she puts up photos of all her travels and it does not make you envious. Then we have John Fletcher, who's a historian and early medieval reenactor based in the southwest of Britain. His book, The Western Kingdom, The Birth of Cornwall, all about the early medieval history of the southwest, and it is on my reading list, John. I will get to it. Then we have Cathie Dunn, who writes historical fiction, mystery and romance. The focus of her current historical fiction projects is on forgotten women of the early Middle Ages. Brilliant, well done, Cathie. Whilst her novels are mostly set in medieval times, she also loves the era of the Sun King, and that's who she's championing tonight, Louis XIV, and all the scandals of the time, such as the affair of the poisons. In her spare time, Cathie loves to explore castles and ruins. Yeah, me too. Allowing her to get into the zone, I like that, with her historical characters, fictional or real. She currently lives in the south of France with her husband and 2 rescue pets. She lives near Carcassonne and I am so envious. Alison Stuart is a lifelong self-styled passionista of the English Civil War period. Australian-born author, is these days better known for her Australian set historical fiction and writing as A.M. Stewart. Her historical mystery series, The Harriet Gordon Mystery, set in Singapore in 1910. But her writing career began with dislocating her shoulder. How? In a skiing accident that led to the writing of her first English Civil War story, the award-winning By the Sword, which is the first in a series including The King's Man and Exile's Return that runs from 1650 to 1660. In total, she's written 6 books set in this period, including a fun time travel, yay, because she's always harboured a desire to travel back to that time, haven't we all? Actually, probably no, not everybody has, but I'm guessing everybody on here has. She is waiting patiently for the moment the English Civil War becomes the new Regency. So far, it has only been 25 years. Yeah, there's a thing about the English Civil War, isn't there? It doesn't, you'd think it would be more popular than it actually is. Right, so they are your authors today. Who wants to go first? Jacquie, seeing as you are the earliest, shall we go with you? Jacquie is championing the Roman times.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm Jacquie Rogers. I'm the author of the Quintus Valerius Mystery Series, and I'll be looking at why my period, Roman Britain, Britannia, is the best period. Best for the people living there, and best from my perspective as a writer of historical fiction. So to start with, the benefits for the Romano-British. The weather at that time was terrific. It's officially called the Roman warm period, and it lasted from AD 100 to 400. Slightly warmer than ours without the nasty effects of man-made climate change. So the Romans brought grapes and winemaking with them. So you could drink wine made from grapes in Britain, as well as importing oceans of the stuff from Spain, France, and the Med. Evidence of a large-scale Roman viticulture has been found as far north as Northamptonshire. And already we have our first major plus of becoming Roman. Second advantage, oh no, let me talk about legs first. Lovers of Spartacus and Gladiator might be wondering about masculine legs and leather skirts. Sorry to disappoint. Yes, the climate was fairly decent in those days, but not that decent. This is still Britain we're talking about. So Romano-British men possibly revealed their plucked hairless legs in summer, but they definitely wore trousers and often a kind of long woolen hoodie called a birus the rest of the year. Moving on to another advantage of being Roman, baths. These were unknown to British residents before and after the Roman period. Queen Elizabeth I is said to have bathed once a year on her birthday, whether she needed it or not. But for the Romans, a daily visit to the baths was more the fashion. And it was as much to drink and gossip and flirt as it was for hygiene. The spectacular baths at Aquae Sulis, Bath in southwest England, probably near where John is, attracted tourists and pilgrims from all over the Western Roman provinces. And as in Regency times, many a marriage was arranged over the steaming spring waters. But clean? Not really. Soap wasn't yet invented, so by the time a few hundred people had scraped off the dirt with olive oil and soaked in the public baths, the water was pretty foul. And even the Romans didn't have antibiotics, so swimming with a razor cut was a dodgy idea. Roads. Yep, this really was something grand that the Romans did for their most northerly province. In fact, the roads were so well constructed, they still form the backbone of much of our modern British road network. If you travel from Exeter to Lincoln, you're on the Roman Fosse Way. Northwest out of London as far as North Wales is Roman Watling Street. And from Gloucestershire as far as South Yorkshire, you'll be on Roman Icknield Street. Peace, the Pax Romana. This was a big bonus of being Romano-British. Well, sort of. It's certainly true that the intertribal ding-dongs, which had been the favourite hobby of the pre-Roman British, ceased. Not surprising, given that Roman Britain was highly militarised throughout its history. 3 or 4 Roman legions with supporting auxiliaries were permanently stationed here, and you really didn't want to mess with those boys. The problem was that long-term garrisons with no wars to fight soon get bored. There are only so many drills, forced marches and wall building you can occupy your troops with. So every so often, these bored soldiers would stage an uprising, declare their own commander emperor, and even march on Rome. Roman Britain became a byword for insurrection. And with a very restive population of Scots on the other side of Hadrian's Wall to keep under control, you couldn't just take the legions back to Rome. Nevertheless, the Pax Romana was a distinct benefit to being Roman, unless you were the one drafted into the army for 30 years. And it must have worked, as the British population skyrocketed to over 3 million, the highest it would be until Tudor times. And moving to me, as a writer of historical fiction, I've picked 3 out of the many benefits of choosing this period. Well, I mentioned the roads earlier. They're really handy for getting my heroes around the place in a hurry. Not to mention the shipping, terrific for getting cargo and people far afield efficiently. And then there's the scale of the setting. I can send my military investigators, Quintus and Tyro, to so many funky places all over Europe and the Med. One currency, one joint language, no border problems, a bit like the EU. In my second book, The Carnelian Phoenix, my heroes head away from Somerset to cross Gaul and on to Rome itself on the trail of murderous conspiracy. One character even sails home from Marseille, right round Spain and back to Britain in a large merchant ship, the likes of which we wouldn't see again until the 18th century. With and literacy. I didn't mention this earlier because the truth is that most of the population, the small farmers, the traders, the peasants, never learned to read or write in either Latin or Brythonic, but anyone working for the government or the army did. Plus, there was a really nifty postal system for the elite. You could get a letter from London to Rome in less than a fortnight. So I can use correspondence to facilitate my plots. Very handy for a mystery writer. Plus, there are the written records I can plunder of historians like Cassius Dio, who's my best Roman friend. So there we are. That's why I think Roman Britain is the best era. Please vote for me.
I unmute myself first. That's fabulous, Jackie. Thank you very much. Oh, I'm just thinking everyone's got a lot to live up to now.
Thank you, Sharon.
Right, who's next? Shall we do it in chronological order? So if I remember right, the next one up is, and of course I forgot to say, I am not biased. I am a medievalist, but John just gets no favours from me. Right, the next one up is the fabulous John Fletcher, who is going to be talking about the best era ever, which is of course the medieval era. So John, over to you. But no,
what an introduction, absolutely. Okay, yeah, so very difficult act to follow, as was Rome, but of course follow we did, because the Romans did fall. So why is my era the best era? Very simply, the medieval era for much of Europe and for all of the English-speaking world is the foundational era for everything. This is the era where there becomes an England, a Wales, a Scotland, where we talk about these countries forming together, the idea of nations and not just tribal groups or over empires and what that means. It's the reason that all of us today are giving these talks in English, a language which has its very first formations when groups of Northern Germanic tribesmen cross the North Sea and arrive here in Britain. It is central to every stage of our history that follows. All of it begins in the medieval period. More than that, when we're talking about writers, it's central to the mythology that we've built up about ourselves. The great work of heroic fantasy that is the foundational steps for all future fantasy, Lord of the Rings, is essentially an early medieval saga. It talks about shield walls, about ring shirts and burnies. It is written by a scholar of the early medieval period who was extremely passionate about that period and the languages that follow it. When we look at the great works from this period, you know, Igododin, Beowulf, these are the things which have informed all of our heroic narratives that followed. It gives us a format and a familiar structure. So that's sort of step one. Step one is that essentially it is the building block from which much of the modern world descends. Step two is that for a writer, it has the great advantage of being infinitely familiar and completely unknown. And what I mean by that is that if you say to somebody the medieval period, they will instantly gather in their mind lots of requisite pieces, depending on a few clues you give them. If you're talking about early medieval, you could say Vikings. Boom, great big hairy Scandinavians, filled in, nice, done, excellent. You could say to them knights, plate armor, castles, women with pointy headdresses, all sorted out. However, a lot of that stuff that everyone knows is completely wrong. So you're given, either as a historian, you've got a lot of room to then bring up new and interesting information, which people may not be aware of previously, or as a historical fiction writer, you can work in completely unexpected narratives or completely counter to this popular image, but completely factually true things, and it will keep your readers engaged and wanting to come back for more. You know, there's things like the idea of this sort of widely illiterate, dirty people, which just aren't true when you look at these great literate works. You know, things like coming out of Tintagel, which is obviously down where I am, that people are there is a literate population which is not only literate, but they are doodling in multiple languages because they're bored. The idea that you have this medieval people who not only can write, but do it without thinking the same way we would do in the corners of a notebook. You have these huge illuminated manuscripts like the Book of Kells, like the Lindisfarne Gospels, like these later sort of big Bibles and immense works of artistic endeavor that all come out of this period where most people's image is, oh, it's dark, it's dirty, it's horrible, people, die or get sick, all the rest of it. And of course, all those things did happen, but all those things also happened for much of human history right up until about 70 years ago. So that's the other thing. It gives you this great freedom to let the reader do a lot of the work and then completely subvert their expectations. Speaking more specifically, when we're in the earlier medieval period, it's a not great time for women, but it's an interesting time for female stories, because you have these great female heroes like Athelflaed, like the woman from Berka who was buried with weapons in what we traditionally consider a very macho-dominated society. You have the ability for Icelandic women to divorce their husbands, something we won't realistically see again for a significant amount of time, at least not without a lot of hassle on how to do. Women are driving the narratives and the great expeditions of this period. They are working in these great sewing endeavors, making long ship sails, making works of art like the Bayeux Tapestry. There is a lot of female stories which don't get the attention that they deserve, but which also, again, give you this great insight and this unexpected way to get into grips with that period. And even, later periods, you have, ladies holding Scottish castles against English knights and confounding them. This is a hugely exciting period. The last thing I will just say is that aesthetically, it's just cool. No one doesn't like swords and castles and knights and Vikings. There is no one who, if you say, my book has all of these things in it, they'll go, sounds really dull, mate, It's just the coolest, and it is a violent period in terms of the negative. There are conflicts, there are intertribal things, but from that springs opportunities for heroism and stories of heroism and things that inspire us. Even the most sort of dark and depressing stories that come out of this, most of which are Welsh poetry, which I had to get infinitely familiar with, they are still stirring. They speak to something deep in us, which is conditioned to listen to stories around the fire of a great hall. It is in our very bones as, people, and more so as, I say, English speaking or people from Northwestern Europe. This is our heritage. This is what we were formed to do. So that is why the medieval period is the best. So hopefully you will vote for me.
Absolutely fabulous argument, John. Really well put. Thank you. Okay, I'm laying it on a bit too thick now, aren't I? Okay, next up, I'm thinking chronologically. It's Alison, so long as she's awake. Because poor Alison is in Australia and it's only 6 a.m. there. So we've got to be very quiet and just let her do her thing. Okay, Alison, over to you.
Thank you, Sharon. And yes, look, I am awake. I've had a cup of tea, unlike some of my fellow speakers who are all guzzling wine, half their luck. It's even a bit early in the morning for me. All right. Yes, Melbourne, Australia. Beautiful, warm day coming up. So eat your heart out. So unlike the previous speakers, I'm just talking about a almost 20-year period of history, not a whole span of history. So it's going to be an interesting contrast. So the English Civil War period covers an 18-year period from 1642 to 1660. And on a macro level, that's probably one of the most important periods in English history. Apart from being a people's revolution that resulted in the execution of a king, it's also the first and only time England experimented with God, it is too early in the morning, with a republic. That's what I'm getting onto. Our own modern democracies, standing armies, judicial systems all have their roots in this period. Now, to be clear about definitions, the period from the execution of the king to 1660, when Charles II was restored, is actually called the interregnum, which basically means between the kings. So it's sort of two periods within one period, if that makes sense. Anyway, history lesson over. Let's bring it back to why I love this period. Perhaps it's best described in the romantic parlance of cavaliers and roundheads. The dashing cavalier with his long curls and his wide-brimmed beaver hat, and the sour-faced roundhead with his cropped hair and Puritan collar. Some of you may have read that darling little book that came out in the 1930s called 1066 and All That, in which the cavaliers are described as wrong but romantic and the roundheads as right but repulsive, which kind of sums it up. Now, family legend actually has it that I'm descended from a regicide, one of the men who signed the death warrant of Charles I. But unfortunately, modern genealogy and modern research has actually found no actual evidence to support that claim. However, never let a fact get in the way of a good story. My own love affair with roundheads and cavaliers began when I was probably no more than 8 or 9. My darling father would read to us every Sunday afternoon, and one such book he chose was Daphne du Maurier's The King's General, which I might add is a highly unsuitable book for an 8-year-old, but didn't matter. It's the story of an ill-fated and fictional love affair between Sir Richard Grenville and his crippled mistress, Honor. Du Maurier remains one of my all-time favourite authors, and the struggle between king and parliament, laced with romance and skeletons in secret tunnels, had me in a thrall. I was lost. The very idea of a civil war threw up so many possibilities for an overactive imagination. Father against son, brother against brother, friends destined to become foes. A few years later, the movie Cromwell was released, with Richard Harris as Cromwell and the wonderful Alec Guinness as Charles I. And of course, who can ever forget a very young Timothy Dalton as Prince Rupert? Be still my fluttering heart. Ignoring the historical inaccuracies, of which there are many, it still gave form and substance to my growing passion for the period, and I immersed myself wholeheartedly in it. I kept scrapbooks of articles cut from magazines. I read every single book, fiction and non-fiction, I could find in the local library, and lived and breathed the English Civil War from the moment I woke up until sleep claimed me. Very hard when you're living in Melbourne, because I didn't have the access to all the places and the battlefields and all of that, which I have now done, but I just had to live with my imagination. My best friend at school was a budding writer like myself, and we set out on our first venture to write a novel at the grand age of 13. Mine, of course, was set in the English Civil War, entitled The Locket of Grace, and here it is. I still have it. Note to self, it is not a bad title, and I should find an appropriate use for it. We did illustrations and planned the books, but I don't think either of us ever finished them. Over my school years, I filled shorthand notebooks with stories, all of which closely resembled the last book I read. Of course, nothing is more guaranteed to kill a grand passion than studying at university. And in the first year of my arts degree, I made the mistake of taking 16th and 17th century history. All my wonderful imaginings and colourful characters were rendered dull and lifeless. And I have to confess, it was many years before I started writing again. But when I did, following that fortuitous skiing accident, I went straight back to my roots and wrote the book that was to become my Eppie Award winner, By the Sword. I'm not sure if I have really answered the question that's been set. When something grips you as a passion, it's very hard to put a logical rationale to it. I just love the English Civil War. I love bucket top boots, laced collars, wide-brimmed beaver hats, buff leather coats and lobster pot helmets. Above all, I love the opportunity through my stories to share this wonderful period with readers. Maybe because it's not well taught in schools, or it certainly isn't here in Australia, or despite it being such an important foundation stone of our modern democracies and judicial systems. Or maybe it lacks the glamour of the French and American revolutions that followed it. It is often overlooked as a rich source of fabulous stories and interesting characters. I've lost track over the years of the number of publishers who have told me they love my books and my stories, but sorry, we can't market that period. Well, yaboo sucks to the publishers. The definition of madness is to go on doing the same thing and expect a different result. So I have turned my writing to other periods of history, but the English Civil War remains my first love. And as brutal and bloody as any civil war is, it is fundamentally important part of our shared histories. But over and above the battles and the intrigues, it is the ordinary men and women who bore the brunt of the struggle, particularly the women, and it's their stories I strive to bring to life. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. That was fabulous. I do wonder why publishers are so reluctant to do Civil War books, because it is a fascinating period, and you've got two very different sides that you can argue for. I know Giles
Yes.
Christian did a Civil War series, and but he never actually managed to finish it because the publishers were like, no, it won't sell. It's
Yep.
sad.
Well, fortunately, indie publishing now allows us at least to have
Yeah.
that voice. So, so get out there and write those English Civil War stories. We will be the next Regency.
Yes. And I know there's at least one person in the audience, Chrissa, who
Yay,
would
Chrissa. Hi,
definitely agree with you. But my son's actually doing it for his history A level, and he's really enjoying it. They're just up to the end of the First War and onto the Second War at the minute. So he
Fantastic.
loves doing
Good to
it.
hear.
Right, next up is The Court of the Sun King and Cathie Dunn.
Thanks very much, Sharon. Hello and welcome to Versailles. Right, the world of King Louis XIV of France, and perhaps a little of his father's reign as well. Most of you know me as a medievalist, and despite being the Middle Ages being my usual stamping ground, there is another era in history that I find fascinating, and that is the reign of Louis XIV of France. And I see that as someone whose hometown was destroyed by his armies as he flooded across southern Germany. So I'm still fascinated by it. I don't bear grudges, fortunately for him, and I still find that era utterly fascinating. And also perhaps a little of his father's era. I mean, who doesn't love a dashing musketeer, eh? And all that, all for one and one for all. I was hooked on their adventures quite early on, and then there was also the romantic story of Angelique. Some of you may be familiar with the rather racy novels about the young noblewoman. And I grew up with these tales, with the musketeers and with Angelique, and perhaps that's one of the reasons I turned to historical fiction with romantic elements, because I do like both. I love the adventure and I love a bit of romance. But it was ever since I read The Oracle Glass by Judith Merkel Riley, who has always been wildly underestimated as an author, I find. Ever since then, I've been interested in one event at a time, and that was the Affair of the Poisons. That was firmly in Louis XIV's reign in the 1670s and 80s, but it actually started much earlier. And my novel, The Shadows of Versailles, is about that era early on. And I'm developing a series of novels about it because the politics, the scheming and everything is utterly fascinating. Really, really fascinating characters involved there. But that episode in history is not the only thing that happened during the 17th century. So forget about those peasants, those medieval peasants and all those. We move on to far more interesting times. On the untimely death of his father, Louis XIII, a young Louis acceded to the throne in May 1643. He was just 4 years old. And despite that, his reign lasted for 72 years. And to date, from as far as we know, he is still the longest reigning monarch, at least in Europe, in history. And during his long reign, the period saw much change. There was a huge shift in political and social power, in working practice, in religion versus science, and also in human thought. The 17th century is a time of great expansion, not only in terms of exploration across the world, but also in terms of invention and of a growing interest and passion for culture, for the arts, an interest in philosophy, astronomy, and particularly in the sciences. Whereas in the past, there would be these guys in the little workshops doing a few little potions. that expanded and grew into a huge, huge business. There was so much going on. And that heralded the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment as well, which is meant to have started in the early 1700s. I think kind of the path was cleared in the 1600s already. And human traits were dissected to explain behaviors, attitudes, and to highlight practices, both good and bad, of course. During that period, medical advances such as early forms of blood transfusion were established, and they helped in discovering treatments that moved away from the earlier, often still medieval, practices, and from the superstitions attached to sickness that we still often found in those days. So despite continuing with his warfare, Louis was involved in one war after another, his focus shifted slightly from government by council, as was his father's rule, to embrace a new political system, a centralized government with an absolute monarch at its heart. The king as the central pillar of the kingdom became the new norm in France, as in England under James VII. At least he tried. It didn't go that well with him. But 17th century monarchs tested how far they could go, and as they tried to secure their hold on power with a mix of more political machinations and brute force, with varying degrees of success. And Louis succeeded, crushing any challenges to his position, and he managed to rein in his quarrelsome nobles too, which was quite an achievement given that they were plotting left, right and centre. And that is a move and a shift that can be regarded both as positive and as negative. Of course, there was stability, but at what price? Price of freedom? But his was also a court, even before he disappeared to Versailles, his was also a court where the arts and sciences flourished. Louis patronized many artists and writers like La Fontaine and Molière, whose works are still valid and still busily read today and studied today. And the newly expanded hunting lodge turned Chateau de Versailles became a dazzling wonder, lavishly decorated with painted ceilings, sculptures, paintings, and sumptuous furnishings. No expense was spared. The country was fairly bankrupt, but we had a beautiful palace that stayed in place just until, sadly, in that way, the French Revolution, when a lot of the original furnishings were sadly destroyed or nicked or burnt or disposed of otherwise, sadly. But it must have looked absolutely impressive. And Louis was a keen dancer and a musician as well, so he founded the Royal Academy of Dance and the Royal Opera in France, in Paris. And he sponsored artists, he sponsored dancers, and he even set up a music competition, some sort of 17th century version of The Voice, where composers tried to win royal favour by composing different pieces of music to be played out in court, and then the courtiers voted on those. So in that respect, we haven't changed very much, I must say. In the 17th century, philosophers like Descartes and John Locke were famous for their works, as was Voltaire, and their achievement opened the doors for further discussion, and they served to highlight the failings of political systems that were in place across Europe at the time. They did not only make friends, but they raised some very important points with that. And then there were the inventions, the era of inventions. Scientists tried everything under the sun. Many failed, but others were successful. Just a few of the inventions, just to remind you what great advancements were made during that time. The refracting telescope in 1608, and the barometer, the first submarine in 1620, steam turbines, and later steam pumps, which paved the way for the Industrial Revolution decades later. Even pressure cookers, and pendulum clock, and the pocket watch. And thanks to Dom Perignon's patent, champagne. Ha, come on. There were also mathematicians, astronomers, and inventors such as Johannes Kepler, Galileo, Blaise Pascal, Isaac Newton, Robert Hooke, Gottfried Leibniz, Edmund Halley, and many others whose works herald an era of discovery, of exploration, and of industry. Working practices changed with the invention of steam turbines and pumps, and treatments for ailments became less of a superstitious assumption and more of a scientific endeavor. Though plenty of people were guinea pigs in a maelstrom of experiments, but they brought everything forward. Humanist thought emerged also as a slight shift from religious dogma, and many were still regarded as heretics by the Catholic Church, desperate to stay in control. And so to sum it up, the 17th century was an era of change, both positive and negative, and of discovery. But you always have to have a balance, so don't ever forget that. Limitations were tested, new ideas emerged, and together with the expansion across the world, it heralded the beginning of a new dawn. And whilst some outrageous designs failed, many of the discoveries are still in practice today, nearly 400 years later. The age of enlightenment began at that time, and much learning has been shared since. Classical music, development of instruments, musical, medical, scientific, and the open discussion of philosophy, politics, and humanism would not have happened had it not been for such a century of research and discovery, a shift away from superstition and narrow thought. Those brave men and women voiced the unthinkable. They tested the waters, often at risk to their own lives, so that every century that followed since could see further progress. And that is why I think my era is better than the others. Thank you.
Thank you, Cathie. That was fabulous. You did miss one point, though, which is that D'Artagnan was around then.
He was, yes. I should have mentioned him, actually. Yes, very true. He did indeed fight for Louis and was killed in the Netherlands. Yeah,
exactly. So the great D'Artagnan. That's always a plus point with me. If D'Artagnan's around, I'm happy.
As long as he's played by Michael York, I'm very happy. Yes.
Okay, and last but by no means least, but with a challenge because she now knows what everybody else's argument is. Salina Baker is going to tell us why the American Revolution is the best.
Cathie and I are going to obviously overlap here since her era is close to my era, but I am defending colonial America and the American Revolution. I've been immersed in this time period for 6 years as an author, and I'm going to continue to stay in that time period for quite a while. So in December 1776, the American Continental Army, led by General George Washington, retreated across New Jersey towards the Delaware River in Pennsylvania. Thomas Paine, an English-born political activist, was with them. On the retreat, he wrote a pamphlet called Crisis Number 1 and wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls." The American Revolution was a time when ordinary women and men did extraordinary things. Benjamin Franklin, he was a Massachusetts boy. He ran away from home and became a printer's apprentice. Joseph Warren, a young Harvard graduate, and Dr. George Washington, a planter from Virginia, Nathaniel Greene, a Quaker from Rhode Island, Daniel Morgan, a backwoods brawling Virginian, Alexander Hamilton, an orphan from the island of Nevis, Abigail Adams, a preacher's daughter from Massachusetts, to name a few. So we have a lot of things going on with regular people who are seeing things changing before their eyes and are doing something about it. In the 18th century, colonial Americans were the wealthiest people per capita in the civilized world. The American Revolution changed their future. The shot heard around the world was fired in Concord, Massachusetts on April 19th, 1775, between militiamen and British soldiers that ignited the American Revolutionary War. It also ignited a world conflict that affected their mother country, Britain, and her holdings and interests, Canada, the West Indies, India, Africa, and Gibraltar, and her enemies, France, Spain, and Holland, the Germanic states who sent paid auxiliaries to fight in the British Army. This was the age of reason, the philosophical movements with a mind toward individuality, society, and human rights. It encouraged colonial Americans to put everything on the line for their freedom from the greatest power in the world. The Enlightenment was a 17th and 18th century intellectual and philosophical movement that contended human knowledge was based on three theories: reason, skepticism, and sensory experience. The central doctrines were individual liberty and religious tolerance. The law of nations was a study of international conduct between independent states. These ways of thinking influenced the American Revolution through consent of the governed. As an example, in 1780, American General Benedict Arnold sold the plans to West Point to the British adjutant of the British Army, Major John Andre. West Point was an important American fort on the Hudson River in New York, which Arnold commanded at the time. Andre was caught with the plans on his person. The law of nations was cited during Andre's trial when the American Army found him guilty of being a spy under the law and usage of nations. The Reformation laid the foundation of ideas of government, its duties and responsibilities, as well as the citizens' duties according to Scripture. Colonial Americans studied the Enlightenment and the Reformation and used these ideas to guide their notions of government and the founding principles of American democracy. Our Declaration of Independence is the embodiment of these ideas, as well as the principles of liberalism and republicanism that formed a new nation. This produced a hybrid theory that developed into Democratic Republic of the United States and subsequently influenced the worldwide spread of representative and constitutional democracy. In 1783, at the end of the American Revolutionary War, there were those who thought the conquering General George Washington would try to become the king of our new nation, and thought he could have done that, but instead he retired home to his home in Virginia. In 1787, he was called to attend the Constitutional Convention, where the standing governmental constitution was revised and became the constitution that we have now. 2 years later, Washington was elected the first president of the United States. His influence is so prolific that there are statues of him in London and Paris. In Thomas Paine's words, the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. That's my argument for the American Revolution period, when people were thinking and saying, yes, let's do something different with the world.
That's fabulous. Thank you, Salina.
Thank you.
Oh my God, this is going to be hard. I'm glad I'm not the one voting. You guys in the audience are the ones voting. So just remember that. You've got to decide. I'm going to ask one question, the same question to everybody, and we'll see what you all come up with. What is, if you could only say one thing that makes your era the best era, just one thing, what would you say? Jackie?
Wow, that's a tough one. I think it's the travel.
You should know it, actually, Jackie, because it's basically, what have the Romans ever done for us?
I think it was the freedom to be part of a vast empire where you could travel, you could read, you could explore, you could share ideas, and you could bring them back home and make home better. I think that was the only time in European history where peace and construction was good enough that that could happen, right the way through until after the end of World War II.
Thank you, Jackie. John, what did the medieval era do for us?
I think it kind of relates back to what I said about its core to our foundational mythos. And that's the greatest thing about it is the instability of the period in many respects. So as a negative that, you know, it's unstable. It's not the Pax Romana, it's not the later Peace of Nations or anything else. But the reality is, in the chaos and in this mixture of different places becoming nations, you have much more freedom for one person to make an enormous impact. You know, you can go from a leader of 4 dudes to founding the kingdom that one day becomes England. You know, you can carve out a life for yourself, and there's no one to tell you no, because they haven't been established yet.
That's brilliant. Yeah. The talking about what one individual, the one I've been writing about for the last year is Nicola de la Haye, who defended Lincoln Castle against French invaders and rebel barons in 1217. And yeah, she was a 60-year-old widow. Nobody, she shouldn't be doing that, but she did it, and she could. Alison, what did the English Civil War do for us?
It didn't give us education. No, the English Civil War, such a short period of time, such a fundamental effect on the whole world in terms of it being a people's revolution, the experiment with the Republic. It is the basis for our democracies and judicial systems going forward.
Yeah,
that's a lot for a very short period.
It is actually that experiment with democracy, with republicanism, though it didn't pan out. It set the tone.
No.
I don't think you would have had the French Revolution if you hadn't had the English one. Not
absolutely
way,
not.
You know,
both the American and French revolutions follow on from the English Revolution. I mean, as somebody said in the comments, everything is interrelated. You know, you can't just kind of separate them out.
It is. So, Cathie, I mean, I've told you what the best thing about Louis XIV is, and that's D'Artagnan. Well, what is the second best thing that Louis XIV did for us?
Well, apart from a dashing musketeer, I think it's the ability to share our thoughts. It's the humanism, the philosophy that we question things. We don't take the dogma for granted and repeat as the authorities tell us. We question things. We learn to rationalize things. We learn to discover and explore. And I think for me, that's the most important part, because it's still valid today. It still allows us today to question things, to voice our opinions, to seek other opinions and other solutions as well. So that's for me the most important aspect, apart from D'Artagnan.
Apart from D'Artagnan, yeah. But D'Artagnan's the first one. I mean, it's D'Artagnan. It's my hero. I can't help it. Salina, the American Revolution. I think you've actually already said the main thing about the fact that anybody could do
yes,
it
kind of set the precedence for the land of opportunity, where anyone could come here and be anything they wanted to be. And I think that the American Revolution set that precedence and just gave people a different way of looking at things. You could be a farmer, or you could be the richest guy in the world, but you had a chance eventually to be able to do anything you wanted to do. And I think that's where the precedent was set, was during that time period.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Well, if everybody, you're welcome to turn on your cameras now, everybody. Anybody wants to. If anyone else has another question, or if any of the panelists have a question for any of the other panelists, please feel free. Nothing? All right, fair enough. Let me think. Have I got another question? Okay, yeah, I do have. This one you haven't actually considered. Well, I'd just be interested to hear what everybody's views are. What's the worst thing about your period? Cathie.
Okay, the worst thing about the period, I think, is the idea of absolutism and absolute power.
Yeah.
That sets the scene for some nasty eras to follow at the time and later into modern day, really, as well. But I think that for me was an aspect that I find quite terrifying, because with that power comes force. With that force comes restriction for groups of people, like the Huguenots, which Louis pursued, and those who saw differently. So for me, it's that kind of absolutist power thing that is quite scary.
I like that. John, what's the worst thing about the medieval period? Besides the no antibiotics.
I was going to go with disease, if I'm honest, because I think the usual answers have a counter. You know, people think it's dirty. Well, actually, you know, until the plague, the bathhouses were open in Germany and places like that. We know, like, the Romano Britons did maintain a certain amount of hygiene. Even the Saxons, the Vikings, were very fastidious with their appearance and things like that. But realistically, despite still having a good amount of knowledge about lots of other things, about, you know, Bede saying the world was round, all this kind of stuff, they had no concept of microbiology. So when people start dropping dead around you, it kind of very quickly escalates without them being able to stop it.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's true, actually. Yeah, definitely. It's the plague. It must have been so scary for them. Alison.
Well, of course, the worst thing about my period of history was that it was a civil war, and it was brother against brother, and families divided. And there was a huge death toll, both in battle and also from disease later on as well. Huge. I've forgotten the figures off the top of my head, but a large proportion of English died one way or another. And it was a terrible period. There's no doubt about it. And I don't actually think I really would like to go back in time now to that period, because it was a war, it was a civil war, and it was brutal and it was bloody.
Salina, the worst thing about the American Revolution? Well, besides the fact that you no longer have our king as your king, you know, which must be devastating for you.
Hey, all Revolutionary War enthusiasts love to read about the king, believe me. That's part of it. I think, yeah, it was part of it was the disease. They didn't understand what was killing them. Like malaria was rampant in the South, and it was wiping out, you know, armies down there, the British and the Americans. And the population, of course. And also the revolution drove the government, well, there was not really a good government, but what government we had, into bankruptcy. And a lot of people came out of the war destitute and in debt. And it took a long time for the country to get that together and people to get adjusted back to normal life. And I think that was probably real brutal, that part there.
That's good. I didn't know that about the debt afterwards. Jacquie, worst thing about the Romans?
It's something that I didn't mention at all in my speech when I was pitching for all your votes, but I think I have to mention the slavery system. Yeah. Not so much from the individual point of view. It wasn't based on race like the American slavery system. It was based on whether you'd been captured in war, whether you were the child of a slave, whether you'd become a slave because you committed a criminal act, etc., etc. And it's true to say that a lot of slaves in Rome did very well for themselves. In fact, some of them became amongst the wealthiest people in the empire and had slaves of their own and could buy their freedom. However, the reason I think slavery was a very misconceived concept was because economically it limited Rome's ability to develop. And I'm pretty convinced that the provision of huge amounts of free labor stopped them inventing more mechanical means to develop industry and economy, because lots of those early ideas, like Archimedes' screw, I know he's a Greek, but, you know, same period. There were lots and lots of proto ideas that later fed into the Industrial Revolution, but they weren't developed because it was always cheaper to use slaves. So for me, slavery from lots of different angles is probably the worst thing about Rome.
Yeah, I agree with you. I read Stephen A. McKay wrote a book, Lucia. She's a Roman slave, and it's one of the most heartrending stories I've ever read. It was so well written. So if you want to read about Roman slavery, read Lucia by Stephen A. McKay. Lynn Marie has asked a brilliant question, which I wish I'd thought of. Is there a favourite piece of literature from your period in time? John? You're on mute.
Yeah. I missed my click, sorry. In terms of literature written in my period, it would probably be between Beowulf and the Elegy for Grant. The Elegy for Grant is quite an obscure piece of Welsh poetry, which is about a king of Daemonia, which was the kingdom of the Southwest Britons in Devon and Cornwall, and essentially is about him heroically charging and how great and noble he is, but he and his men get horribly slaughtered, and isn't it sad? Which is what much of Welsh heroic poetry is about. The reason I find Welsh heroic poetry in general, but that one in particular, is that within the kind of concepts of, oh, it's quite sad, but it's heroicism at the liminal point, at this kind of feeling where the world is in decline, or you know, we are on the back foot, but we still will stand up and fight for ourselves and fight for our country. So it conveys this great sense of kind of defiance in the face of the odds, that, you know, we may die, but we were still charged. The horse is home, and we'll lead this heroic endeavor, basically.
Yeah. Salina, do you have a favorite piece of literature from your era?
Not really literature, probably more the propaganda that was written by, like, Thomas Paine, like I mentioned, and there wasn't a whole lot of literature coming out of that short time period during the American Revolution. They spent a lot of time reading literature that was written by European people. So I don't have a good answer for that one, as far as actual literature is concerned.
That's fair enough. They were too busy fighting really to write it down, so you can't blame them.
Oh, they were writing it down.
Jacquie.
Yeah, I'm going to cheat and pick two. One is the letters of Pliny the Younger, who actually, as a teenage boy, witnessed the eruption of Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii from a boat which his uncle Pliny the Elder, who was the admiral of the fleet, insisted got rowed so close to the eruption that Pliny the Elder died. But Pliny the Younger survived, and he became governor of one of the provinces bordering the Black Sea as an older man. And he conducted a series of correspondence with the then emperor Trajan. And we still have some part of that correspondence, and they're real eye-openers as to how the emperors governed through their governors and the sort of questions that came to and fro. Some of them were tiny nitty-gritty things. Can I have an extra policeman in this place in my province? Stuff like that. So those were lovely. And the second person I'd like to give a shout out to is Cassius Dio, who is a historian and senator who was front and centre, right bang slap in my period during the Severan reigns. And I like the gossipy nature of Cassius Dio so much, I've given him a bit part in my second book.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jacquie. Alison.
Well, it was really an era of poetry. Of course, we have John Milton and Andrew Marvell, who were writing their amazing poetry in that period. And also the great, my favourites, the great Cavalier poets, such as Richard Lovelace, to Lucasta going to the wars, and those sort of very romantic poems. So they've got my vote.
Brilliant. Cathie. I'm just thinking you've got Voltaire to choose from, haven't you?
I know. I've got all the very serious ones and the sarcastic ones, so it's a really big choice here. But I think apart from those, one of my favorites would be The Adventures of Don Quixote, yeah, which were written in the early 1600s, or published in the early 1600s, so a little bit before Louis, but Louis XIV. But it was a bit of a parody, and it showed that even in those days, people could really take the mickey out of themselves and their station and their quests as well. So it was, I remember reading it, and it was one of those really fun adventures to read, but also with a little bit of a message in there as well. But yeah, you've got all the greats, the serious and not so serious greats. You've got La Fontaine as well, whose background I read a bit when I wrote The Shadows of Versailles, because Fleur, the main girl, is meant to be his niece, because I wanted to bring some real people in. So I discovered quite a bit about him as well. Very, very interesting character.
Brilliant, thank you. Elizabeth Corbett asks, why did you choose your favourite time period, or what led to that? That's an interesting question, actually, because I tend to think I don't think I chose the medieval. I think it chose me. I ended up writing something and it just carried on, sort of thing. So did you choose your time period, or did it choose you? Choices. Alison.
Well, I actually think I probably already answered that you know, it was it stemmed back to my father reading the King's General to me. And look, it's just, I think it chose me, and it's been a passion, and always will be a passion. I have a bookshelf full of books there that you can have. Yeah, so it'll always be my go-to period. Much easier to write books on the English Civil War than Victorian goldfields, I'm finding. But anyway, there we go.
Cathie.
Oh, I think both my favorite eras found me. I'm not talking about the Middle Ages today, but I think growing up in a town with a kind of castle, with a kind of late Renaissance, early Romance castle, meaning Heidelberg in the southwest of Germany, which was destroyed by Louis XIV. General, very kindly, because of course our dear Lieselotte was his sister-in-law. She comes from my neck of the woods, so there's always been this kind of link there. Plus, it's an hour from the French border, the modern French border. So we popped across quite regularly. So I've always been interested in French history, but also because in my area there are a lot of medieval castles. I'm kind of torn in two ways, but I think the eras found me rather than me them. But yeah, it's
Yeah, I
fascinating.
must say I did grow up next door to a medieval castle, so that it does help.
It does. It really does. Yeah.
Salina.
I started out writing, excuse me, the Victorian era, and I did a couple of books on that, and then I wanted to move to something else, and I realized that I knew quite about the American Revolution, and I wanted to learn more about it. And so when I wrote the 4-book series on it, even though it's historical fantasy, I learned an immense amount. It was like giving myself a college degree in the American Revolution. And it just proliferated. There's battlefields here. There's, you know, people are buried here. My husband's dragged all over the country to all these different places. And the more I go, the more in love I am with it. And it's also taught me things about England and France and their allies and their enemies. And it's just this huge, giant picture that just gets bigger and bigger every time you read more or every time you go somewhere. And it just swept me away and kept me fascinated.
Fabulous. Okay. Okay.
Actually, it's my mother's fault. She bought me my first Rosemary Sutcliffe novel when I was 7. And after that, I was totally hooked on Roman Britain. And then at one point when I was about to retire from university teaching, we moved to Somerset and I went to the Taunton Museum, and there were all the elements of my first book: a mysterious hoard, a burnt down 3rd century villa, and an over-stamped lead ingot from which the silver had not been removed, even though it should have been. And I thought, I have to write a story about this, and it just built from there.
Brilliant. I like that. Blame Mum. John, who do you blame?
My dad. No. To be fair, it's my family are all giant nerds, as I am. So when I was growing up in Pennsylvania, we did a lot of car journeys, as you do in America. And my dad had brought with him, because he's English, a BBC adaptation of The Lord of the Rings on about 18 CD-ROMs, I think it was, that he'd kind of just keep popping in. So I grew up with this sort of real love of fantasy and all that kind of stuff. And then when I was 18, I went to a medieval reenactment event, and there were, you know, slightly overweight guys beating 7 layers of hell out of each other. And I thought, that sounds awesome. And my dad said, have you ever thought about doing that? And I went, no. And it turned out there were some Vikings near me. So I went over, they showed me a giant 2-handed axe, and being 18 and a giant nerd, I thought, sold, done. And then specifically, I spent a couple of years doing reenactment, and then I went to Plymouth for university. And I kind of thought to myself, this is more in relation to my book and like the Cornish stuff. I'll make a new character because I'm down here, because we do sort of background, so you can explain to people when you're doing crafts and living history, this is who I'm representing. And I had this kind of idea that the Cornish aren't the same as the English, and I had no further idea other than that. And then I started researching all of that, and over the course of about a decade, because I ended up staying here when I wasn't intending to, because I met my wife here and we started a family here, I built up this sort of pile of information about early medieval Cornwall and Devon. And then I kind of went, I should possibly write a book about this, and then I did. So, yeah.
Brilliant. I love the way we all accidentally write books. Right, it's a great question from Chrissa. What aspect of your era do you think modern readers can most relate to? Salina.
I'd say it's the whole hero thing, you know, the guys marching onto the fields and facing off with the enemy and the cannon and the horses. It's just like any other time period where there's all this romantic stuff that can be built around these battles and what they're fighting for. So I think that's probably what people can relate to most of all. The heroics of it all. We're the small guy, and you guys are the big guys, and the little guys win the battles against the big guys. I think it's that. There's a name for it, and I can't think of it right now. But I think it might be that kind of romanticism type stuff.
Brilliant, thank you. Jacquie.
Yeah, I think a lot of modern people would recognize a system of government in which you have law, you have structures, you have a Senate, you have local representation, and you have a profound peace which is maintained at the borders to keep enemies out, but to allow people to progress, make a decent living, and have a better standard of living than the children before them. And for a really long time, Rome worked really well at doing that. So I think that would seem familiar to modern people.
Alison. You're on mute. To tell people they're on mute.
Sorry. It's a hard question. I agree with Salina. There is that romantic aspect of conflict, of battles, of bucket top boots and gorgeous hats and lace collars. But I do think modern people really do need to understand how important that very short period of our history was in terms of where we are. I mean, Australia, America, Britain, where we all are today, derives from that little conflict that happened in the middle of the 17th century. It's such a fundamental building block for what's come after. So yeah, I hope modern readers do understand that. I mean, from a romantic point of view, they make great romantic stories, but there is more to it than that. There is that depth.
John.
I'll do sort of two answers, only because one of them is kind of a cheat. So I'll do a cheat answer and then a proper answer. The cheat answer is, and this is something I've always said to people when I've talked about my book or I've talked about reenactment stuff, is that fundamentally, when you look at any period, you see that people are always people. They are trying to do better for their children than they had for themselves, and they're very human. There's an excavation, I believe in the Ukraine, where they found the doodles of a child from the sort of Viking age, and he's drawing big scary bears with triangle claws and stuff, and it's just something that you could see on any classroom or any child's desk. It links you very strongly to these are still just human beings. So that's my cheat answer because it applies to everybody. My real answer, I think, goes back to what I said previously, that for the medieval period, and particularly the early medieval period, there is something profoundly human about the idea of gathering in a communal hall with the fire burning on the tables, drinking together, telling stories, laughing, binding together as people. And I think part of that is Northwestern Europe, where it gets dark in winter and you're trying to maintain the warmth against the cold. Part of it's just human nature. You see similar things in Polynesia, you see similar things in Africa. This is what we're meant to do. We are naturally storytellers.
Brilliant. Cathie.
Well, I think the one thing that modern readers can probably link the most is Versailles Castle, the palace.
Mm.
It still exists. The original furniture from Louis' days is gone, but you can still see the art, kind of the rooms, the style. You can see how sumptuous it was. And I think it is the most visited place in France. Millions see it every year. So there's still this very strong sense of it's something that you have to see, that you have to visit.
And you can't do it in one day. I did it. I lived in France for 6 months, and I went 3 times, and I still hadn't seen everything. When you just need a day for the garden.
That's true, and especially out of season. I had the fortune to meet my American family in Paris 3 years ago, which was nice, but the misfortune to spend kind of 3/4 of a day in Versailles, and they raced through the building, found it very interesting. I was like, okay, Steph, you coming. And I didn't have enough time, so I'm planning to go back because, as you say, it requires probably a whole week.
I was in my early 20s, and it's where I learned to look up when visiting a historic place. Because you just look at the ceilings themselves. You just need one day to just look at all the ceilings because they're incredible. Yes, absolutely incredible. And ever since then, every time I visited somewhere, my son knows it now. I'm going, don't forget to look up.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's part of his legacy that there's still such an interest in it. And okay, they've cobbled together furniture from later centuries now and filled it, which is also very nice. They still have some beautiful pieces in there, but very, very few of the original ones, because it was really all ripped out during the revolution, sadly, and much was lost. But it's still the most visited site in France. So yeah.
Well, I think we need to get to the vote time. So if everybody, do you know how to vote, everybody? There's reactions button on the screen. I think that's the way you do it, isn't it? If you press the reactions button, there's a raise hand option. So when I give you the era, you raise your hand if you think that's the best, and then I will try and count. Nancy Clark's already raised her hand. What have I done? Nancy, are you just practicing, or do you want to say something? If you want to take your microphone off.
Yeah, I was just practicing. This is the first time I've done Zoom.
Okay, that's great. Well, you know how to do it. So put your hand down again. If you just press the raise hand button again, that will let you put it down. So we're going to start with the first era. Is the Romans, championed by Jacquie Rogers. If you want to vote for the Romans, what the Romans did for us as the best era, put your hands up. Jacquie, you get to vote as well. All the authors get to vote, all the panelists get to vote as well. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I assume Jackie's going to vote as well. Yeah. So we have 5 for the Romans. Okay, if you guys can put your hands down, I will write that down, 5 for the Romans. Next we have the medievalists. So can you put your hands up if you want to vote for the medievalists? And I know I'm impartial, so I voted.
For once I'm not.
Cathie, I thought you put your hands up.
I know.
That's 7 for the medievalists. Okay, now I'm feeling guilty. Because I did it. Right, lower your hands, everybody. Right, English Civil War. Can you put your hands up if you vote for the English Civil War? I was going to say, where's Chris? So that's 2.
I'm here. I'll put 2 hands up if it helps.
Okay, and next one is Cathie Dunn and the Court of Louis XIV. Okay, we have 3 for Louis. Oh, he will not be happy. I'm not telling him. Okay, hands are down, guys. And last but by no means least, we have Salina Baker and the American Revolution. 1, 2, 3. Is that it? Everybody voted? Okay. Okay. I'm feeling less guilty now because my vote didn't tip the medievalists into winning. Medievalists won anyway.
Well done.
Thank you very much.
Everyone for coming. I hope you've had as fun a night as I have. I've really enjoyed tonight. Thank you so much to our panelists, Jacquie Rogers, Salina B. Baker, Cathie Dunn, Alison B. Stuart, and John Fletcher for being great advocates for their chosen eras and for giving up their evening or breakfast in Alison's case or lunch in Salina's case to join us this evening. Thanks very much everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you, Sharon,
Take care.
for hosting.
Thank
Thanks,
you
guys.
guys.
Thank you.
I've really enjoyed it. It's been a great night. You've all been absolutely fabulous. I know it's your first ones with the Historical Writers Forum for 3 of you, and you've been brilliant. Well done.
Been
Thanks
fun.
very much.
Really nicely done.
Anytime.
Yeah, absolutely.
Except not 1 a.m. Anytime, as long as it's around 6 a.m. and not too often. Right, I've got to go and take the dog a walk now. So thanks,
No worries.
guys. It
Thanks very
was
much, everybody.
Thanks very much.
fabulous evening.
Bye.
Have a lovely
Thank
rest
you
of the
all.
weekend.
I was not smiling.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.